that's the people that own the building.
Yeah, everybody in this room that's a San Marino resident owns the building. Appreciate that. Welcome everyone to our.
The computer died, John.
I noticed that. Thank you, Bill. Our November edition of the Centennial Speakers Series for the San Marino Historical Society. This has been a little bit of a challenge, but it's been a challenge worth fighting through and making sure it works during the city's centennial to try and do programs almost every month of the year. And we're working pretty well, as you'll hear at the end of the meeting, that we have a bunch of them for next year as well. Couple of things I would like to share with everybody is if you may not have noted, that the book on the centennial, San Marino, its first 100 years, the centennial book, is on sale many places in town. It will also be on sale during the Christmas on the Drive at the Chamber of Commerce that evening, so you can pick it up there. You can pick it up at the library any time the library is open. It's been very popular. We've got tremendous comments about it. Really appreciate that. One other thing I do want to do while I'm up here for this time is I would like to recognize one individual, a neighbor of mine, a friend of mine, who has a little bit to do with this evening's program, maybe not necessarily, her uncle did. Her uncle, K.L. Carver. This is Martha Mulfinger. Martha, just wave your hand at everybody. You'll hear a little bit about that. This has been a fun time to get Bill Enger out here. Bill is a native Southern California. He's an attorney. He graduated from Berkeley, got his law degree at UCLA, and as somebody that grew up in a Stanford family, graduated from USC, I still consider him a Finn. But Bill's going to talk to us a little bit about Miguel Blanco or Michael White, not so much the Adobe, but about the individual. So why don't we get into it, Bill?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's an absolute delight to be here. Thank you so much for coming and spending a little bit of your time. It's the start of the holiday season, so I know the time is precious, and I hope that you will think that it was time well spent. A few things, a few rules that I like to go by when we're speaking is that please, if you have something to say, raise your hand. Let's have a discussion. I know I am here at the San Marino Historical Society talking about San Marino history. I know I don't have a monopoly on this, so if anybody has a question or a comment, something to add, a different viewpoint, that is great. And I note, I'll try to ignore, but I note there's a camera. There's a camera in the back, so this will be recorded. And I just want to say, especially for those who will see this later, that the camera adds 10 pounds. So, this presentation will be 2 parts Michael White, roughly 1 part the Michael White Adobe. You can see the pictures over to my left, which is, of course, was constructed and remains on the site of the San Marino High School campus. So it's an interesting interplay that we have here with the involvement of a historic structure on the high school, and that is very much a part of the presentation, very much a part of why many of us are here. I am the secretary of the Friends of the Michael White Adobe, and we are doing our best to make sure that Michael White Adobe is preserved and put to a use that is consistent with its location and dignifies its history. I will just recognize Ann Gray as our president. John Morris is our vice president and treasurer. Gene Dryden is our chairman. If I'm missing somebody, I apologize. Oh, Bill Ellinger from Pasadena Historical Society sits on our board as well. Have some notes here. I just want to say a bit about how I came to know Michael White before I jump into the slides. It had to do with getting interested in the Adobe and wondering why it was there. And I very quickly realized that he's a really, really interesting character, Michael White. He was born at the beginning of the 19th century, did amazing things. He went on a whaling vessel, fought pirates, went to Hawaii in the 1820s, came to California, was involved in gun battles and revolutions, was imprisoned, had 13 kids. I mean, he is, to me, one of the most interesting men in the world, and they would have made Dos Equis commercials if you were alive today. I want to say a bit about some of the assistance and my resources, since this is the San Marino Historical Society. Primarily in drawing up this program, I relied on a small book, and I just have a Xerox copy. It's called California All the Way Back to 1828. And most of what we know about Michael White is contained in these few, it's maybe 100 pages, maybe not even. And it's an oral history he gave in 1877 when he was 76 years old. It's kind of a rough read. Michael White was not a deeply educated man in a schooling way. But you can tell he's intelligent and he cares about certain things and he has opinions, and it's a fascinating read. It's a first-hand account really of the story of California. However, it's by far complete, and so I drew on a couple other items, and we'll actually read from a few pages of this. This is Richard Henry Dana's book, 2 years before the Mass, and I thought it was really interesting because Dana was in California going up and down the coast doing coastwise trade at the same time that Michael White was just coming here. He was an educated man. He was a Harvard law grad who jumped aboard this trading vessel for 2 years. And so his observations are the observations of someone who really knows the language. And you learn a lot from that about places and people and the way of life. And finally, and this is a library copy. You can check this out after I return it. Usually I'm late. It is called In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. This is not a history, contemporaneous history, such as Dana's book is, but this is an account of the whale ship Essex, which left Nantucket Bay in the 1820s, went around the Horn like Michael White did, and wound up in the Pacific, and there was a shipwreck. And it was a fantastical event at the time because there was cannibalism involved. We're not getting into that, but Michael White, as you'll hear, spent quite a bit of his teens on a whaling vessel, so I drew on that for some color. Michael White was born about 211 years ago, and so he lived and died before San Marino became a town, but I think it's important for the centennial. Well, San Marino is celebrating its 100 years, a very proud moment. Michael White is past 200 years, and I always remember that because my daughter was born about 200 years after he was. And so that gives us a sense of perspective. And even though he was, his time was before the time of the city, he was really seminal. You'll see how he brought some of the people, some of our founding fathers to the area, was involved in the development of the ranchos and the development of the political goings-on. I'm not going to say without him there wouldn't be a San Marino, but I would say that he certainly adds to the color and to our history. And it's worth thinking about him as we celebrate San Marino history. Michael White was born in England. He was an Englishman. And I think he probably always viewed himself Englishman first, Mexican second. And I don't know. I suppose he became an American citizen, but if he was, I'll be right out, he was probably ambivalent about it. And we'll see that some of his early experiences with Americans and the Americans that came were not always positive. I would like to read now just a few words from the introduction of his oral history. These are not his words. These are of the editors. but it gives a fair idea of his character. Michael White was one of the earliest foreigners to settle in California. He was characterized by Benjamin Wilson as a man of roving disposition, he would know. White made a number of sea voyages, claimed to have taken part in the first shipbuilding enterprises in California, traveled from California to New Mexico, and back in 1839 and 1840 was a pioneer on Catalina Island, in Cajon Pass near San Bernardino, and in now what is San Marino, his adobe stands. It seems probable that White's Point, or San Pedro, was named for him. We're not going to go into all of that. But let's launch into his early years. He was so born in 1801. Not long later, he's aboard a whaling vessel, a young man. And it's not unusual for the time for young boys to be signed on a whaling vessel and to go out to sea for months and months or even years. In fact, in the Essex book, it describes a voyage of 2 years, and there's a young man on that ship who was 14 years old. And he left home for 2 years, and this is not in the age of where I can pull out this and text somebody in China. When you're gone, and you might be able to get a letter back on a ship. No family, you're under the command of the captain, and you're working very hard. And that's my son when he was 13. And I have to say, I think of this, and I have two thoughts, and anyone who's had a 13-year-old boy in the house probably thinking the same two thoughts. It's like, how can I do that? And then you think, what a horrible fate for a young boy. Really a boy to get into a man's world, hard work, and Michael White never went home. And you can tell from his autobiography that he got homesick. But he never saw England again. And for me, I can't imagine our children, and it would be rare, I think, for any child in this world today to be put in a similar situation. So where did this boy go? He went here. He started way up there on the left-hand corner through the Atlantic Ocean, around the Horn, to the Pacific Ocean, up the Pacific side of South America. Why did he go there? That's where the whales were. So it used to be that the whales were in the Atlantic, and they were overfished. And then they went into the South Atlantic, and they were overfished. So by the time that Michael White was on the whaling ship in the 18-teens and 1820s, he had to go thousands and thousands of miles away from home. Cape Horn was one of the most dangerous passings in the world. In the summer, which is the only time they could go through, it was frequently horizontal rain and sleet and ice on the ship, and they were sleeping 4 hours. And this is really a middle schooler doing this work. And I guess now this would be an appropriate time to introduce our first surprise guest. I have a middle school boy, a leader, a great student, Christopher Kroll, and I've asked him to read a bit from Dana's book about what life was like on board, working on board a ship. Christopher, I thought, was the ideal candidate because I know he gets up in front of people, and I know that he's the president of the Interact Club at Huntington Middle School. So I'll step aside for just a few seconds and let Christopher read a little bit about a day in the life of a whaler. Yeah, you stand.
The morning begins with the watch on decks turning to at daybreak, and washing down, scrubbing, and swabbing the decks. This, together with filling the scuttlebutt with fresh water and coiling up the rigging, usually occupies the time until 7 bells, half after 7, when all hands get breakfast. At 8, the day's work begins, and lasts till sundown with the exception of an hour for dinner. Before I end my explanations, it may be well to define a day's work, and to correct a mistake mistake prevalent among landsmen about a sailor's life. Nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Are not sailors very idle at sea? What can they find to do?" This is a natural mistake, and being frequently made, it is one which every sailor feels interested in having corrected. In the first place, then, the discipline of the ship requires every man to be at work upon something when he is on deck, except at night or on Sundays. Thank you. At all other times, you will never see a man on board a well-ordered vessel standing idle on deck, sitting down, or leaning over the side. It is the officer's duty to keep everybody at work, even if there is nothing to be done but to scrape the rust from the chain cables. In no state prison are the convicts more regularly set to work and more closely watched. No conversation is allowed during the work among the crew at their duty, and though they frequently do talk when aloft or when near one another, yet they stop when an officer is nigh.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you very much. So that's what kids did back then, back in the day. And I would just, it's a time when you read history, and if you're a fan of history like I am, one thing that constantly comes out at you is how different the times were. And I can't think of a greater example in that than what Christopher read as to what the 14 and 15-year-olds were doing on board the whaling vessels. And this is really their purpose in going out, was to hunt down the whales. And it was a savage and brutal business. And when they got out to the mid-Pacific, they would leave their ship, get in rowboats, row after these big sperm whales, heave a harpoon into the nose, just the right spot, wear it down. The whale would go for miles and miles, and they would chase after it in this rowboat. And then when the whale was tired, they'd hack it to death. Tough business. And if that dying, angry whale should get a lucky swipe with the tail, they're dead. Again, very different from our day's work. But all the same, it shows, as history shows, every now and then that we're not all that different. Because the reason they did that was for oil. It was for energy. It was the pursuit of energy to light the homes in the day. We saw the Lincoln movie this weekend, and you noticed all the little oil lamps and came from the whales. That's why they depleted the Atlantic Ocean. We're on the way to depleting the Pacific Ocean. It's not too much different to today. Thank goodness we found better technologies than that. But think of the great lengths we go for our energy. Two years, 9 months after coming aboard, Michael White landed in Mexico. And I don't think he intended to stay. But he did. And I just want to read another passage from Dana's book about what the transformation he underwent during this time. And Dana's talking about another kid on his boat. And this is what Dana wrote. My companion on the yard was a lad, the boy George Summersby, who came out on the ship, a weak, puny boy from one of our Boston schools, just like mine. No larger than a spritsail sheet knot, nor heavier than a paper of lamp black, and not strong enough to haul a shad off a gridiron, but who was now, after 2 years, as long as his spare topmast, strong enough to knock down an ox and hardy enough to eat him. So that's what Michael White's like now. Michael White takes liberty, leaves the vessel, is going for a walk, and he's on a horse, and there's an accident, and he breaks his leg. He's no longer useful on the whaling ship. He is continents and oceans away from home. What does the skipper do? Leaves. Michael White is left to stay, fend for himself in Mexico, strange land, he doesn't know the language. He's taken in by a couple And there's not a lot written about this couple other than they cared for him very well for 15 months, nursed him back to health. We can presume they were indigenous, and we can presume there was a bond there. And I think it was that experience that probably colored some of his interactions later on with some of the Mission Indians and some of the other folks in California. Michael stayed in Mexico for probably 5 or 6 years. He got involved in coastwise trade. By now, he was an experienced navigator. He skippered Mexican ships that went up and down Baja, went to Acapulco, up and down the Pacific coast, and was engaged in trade. He was a master of his craft. And in fact, as a young boy, well, I say young boy, really a young man by all sense of the word, in terms of strength and savvy, he got involved with the pirates. And there were some pirates, French and Spanish pirates, who had commandeered another ship, and the English and American consul asked Michael White to battle these pirates and recapture the ship. And I've asked another student to come speak about that. I've asked my daughter, Catherine, and I'm going to ask her to speak really loudly. Come up here, Catherine. She's a 6th grader at Huntington Middle School, and the reason that she's reading this piece, you could stand over here by the microphone, sweetheart. Right here, right here, right here. She's exquisitely trained in martial arts, having studied Taekwondo for the better part of 6 months. And so she knows what she's talking about. Take it away, Catherine.
An American brig named the Lancaster had been taken by some French and Spanish people to make a privateer of. In the fight for the recapture of the Lancaster, I had only 4 men and took her without anything but a boat hook from the 24 men that held her. I was wounded on the shin by a big Frenchman with a cutlass. He struck at my head, but I jumped back and fell on my back. The cutlass peeled my skin. Those pirates that had captured the American brig were carried to Guadalajara, tried and shot. That was in 1820. I was a witness before the English and American consuls on the hill in San Blas. The English consul was named Forbes. I don't remember the name of the American consul and never wanted to, as he was a mean man who offered me $5 for the service I had rendered in the recapturing the brig. I told him to stick it up to his fundament, to his face. I was mad as well as ashamed of the insult. The English consul told him that he had grievously insulted me, that I was entitled to claim 1/3 the value of the vessel.
Thank you. Michael White also was involved in some smuggling. I don't think he really cared necessarily which side of the law he was on, so long as people weren't getting hurt. That's how I would like to think of him. But the priests there were under a lot of pressure to hand their gold over, and so they hired Michael to, and when he was doing the coastwise trade, to smuggle the gold out of the country for these priests. And I think that's how he got by for a few years. At one point, though, however, he saw an opportunity to get on board a vessel to Hawaii. And I'm not sure what the motivation was. Maybe there were two reasons. One was for money. He needed steady work. And also, he thought, and this may seem counterintuitive, going to Hawaii might be an easy way to get home. Because at the time, Hawaii had been discovered and was seen as an important stopping off point and very strategic location in the middle of the Pacific, which is where all the whales were. And so England took a great interest in Hawaii, as did the Russians and also the Americans. And so Michael went there around 1826. So now he's about 25 years old, a very strapping sailor. And I think he thought he might be able to catch a ride home on a whaler going home. That didn't quite happen. Rather, he became a lieutenant in the Hawaiian Navy. I don't know if this was his ship, probably wasn't, but his ship probably looked like this, and he went to island collecting taxes. He did that for about a year and a half, and then the English consul there did give him an opportunity to leave Hawaii aboard a schooner, but not to England. The opportunity was to go to California. And Michael thought about it, and I don't think he meant to stay. He had the option to stay, but the idea was to bring the schooner to California, load it up with horses, and the schooner would return to Hawaii. That's what he did. So 1828, and that's why the title of the book, California All the Way Back to 1828, because that's when Michael White first crossed the Golden Gate. That's where he went first. And the accounts, you could tell that at this point, he's a savvy guy. He knows how to deal. And his first deal was to trade a barrel of whiskey for some otter skins in San Francisco. Just had arrived, met with the local color, they got drunk, he took the whiskey back and went to Monterey. And you had to go to Monterey because that was the capital and that was the port of entry and that's where the customs officer was. Got the customs official drunk, he knew whose palm he had to grease, and made friends with the customs official. So I think we're dealing with a pretty smart worldly character now, 27 years old, skippering his vessel. Went all up and down California. There's not a lot of description, not a lot of color, but he went to probably Bodega Bay. He, as far north as Fort Ross, where the Russians were, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, the Morro Bay, San Diego, and he wound up in San Pedro, back to Santa Barbara, which is where he stepped off and became a Californian. So this is about a year later. And he's a useful man, and they immediately, the local general uses him to help protect the general's family because this is a very tumultuous time in California. California at the time was in between regimes of government. The Spanish had left. There wasn't a lot of control from Mexico, although Mexico had nominal control. There were a lot of what we might call warlords today. Michael could deal with in that environment. And you can tell from his writings that he became friendly with the general, and the general, whenever he came by, gave him silver. And you can tell that Michael's savvy and knows who's the right kind of person to connect with. And that's why he lived to be 85, I think. Doesn't explain why he died penniless, but catching up with my notes, excuse me. I missed a reader. We have to go back. At this point, I would like to invite my other daughter to the stage. This is Anna Inger. Anna is a junior at San Marino High. Anna is involved and has been involved for many years with the YMCA's Youth in Government program. And so Anna really knows about this stuff, and she's going to read about what the government was like in California when Michael White was there. Step over the microphone, please, honey. And then, and what it was like in the 1820s, 1830s. This is from Richard Henry Dana's book.
The government of the country is an arbitrary democracy, having no common law, and nothing that we should call a judiciary. Their only laws are made and unmade at the caprice of the legislature, and are as variable as the legislature itself. They pass through the form of sending representatives of the Congress to Mexico, but as it takes several months to go and return, there is very little communication between the capital and the distant province, meaning a member usually stays there as a permanent member, knowing very well that there will be revolutions at home before he can write and receive an answer. Revolutions are a frequent occurrence in California. They are got up by men who are at the foot of the ladder, are in desperate circumstances, just as a new political organization may be started by such men in our own country. As for justice, they know little law but will and fear.
Takes after her mother. Thank you, sweetheart. So where was I? Oh. This was still a time where the missions in California were very important. The Spanish had left, and the Mexican government had instituted a series of laws that are called generally secularization, which meant they were stripping the missions of their land and the wealth to kind of a program to fund the government, basically, roughly speaking. Still, the missions were important cultural centers, and the missions were very important. At Mission San Gabriel, there was Father Zalvalides, who had been there since the beginning of the early days of the 1800s, and Father Zalvalides built the old mill. And so it's interesting, and to me, the old mill and the La Presa Dam show how important San Marino was to the San Gabriel Mission. San Gabriel Mission, to me, was the womb of Los Angeles, and it was because the water was here in San Marino that the father built the old mill as a grist mill, and it later became an important residence, of course. It was here that Michael White began meeting important people in the early California community. One of the earliest white settlers was John Chapman, was there around the mission. Pio Pico, twice governor of California, was a figure that was around the mission. And the list goes on and on and on. And we'll keep talking about Michael White's relationship with mission people. But it was here, I think, that he really identified himself as a Mexican, to the extent that he was political. I'm going to ask another speaker to come up in just a second, but before I do, this is an image of a map. It's not very clear on the screen, but I think it'd be a great investment to buy the San Marino Centennial book from the Historical Society. And in that book, you'll see a beautiful, bright reproduction of this map. But you see Mission San Gabriel up there in the middle. You see the Mission Santa Ana, San Juan, but you would also read the names of all the ranchos in the area. Of course, the mission land was sold as ranchos, and here we had Rancho Santa Anita, of course, Hugo Reed's property, and he also owned property, and I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it, became Lake Vineyard, which became the Wilsons and the Pattons.
Rancho San Pasquale.
Rancho San Pasquale.
Part of it.
No.
Urata de Cuate.
Right, thank you. Whatever she said. But anyways, that was mission land too that became part of the rancho. And Michael White had something to do with that. At this time, I've run out of daughters, so I'm going to call someone who's the closest thing I have to a third daughter, and that is Mackenzie Diaz. I've seen Mackenzie around our house, and she was that big. Mackenzie is a great, she's a junior at San Marino High School. Mackenzie is a great athlete, and she's with the pep squad, right? Soccer, cheerleading, right? And Mackenzie was so good to talk a little bit about the way people were during the Rancho period of California.
The fondness of dress among women is excessive, and is sometimes their ruin. A present of fine mantle, or of a necklace or pair of earrings, gains the favor of the greatest part. Nothing is more common than to see a woman living in a house of only 2 rooms, with the ground for a floor, dressed in spangled satin shoes, silk gown, high comb, and a gilt, if not gold, earrings and necklace. If their husbands do not dress them well enough, they will soon receive presents from others. Next to the love of dress, I was struck with the fineness of the voices and beauties of the intonations of both sexes. Every common ruffian-looking fellow, with a slouched hat, blanket, cloak, dirty underdress, and soiled leather leggings, appeared to me to be speaking elegant Spanish. It was a pleasure simply to listen to the sound of the language before I could attach to any meaning of it. They have a good deal of Creole drawl, but it is varied by an occasional extremely rapidity of utterance in which they seem to skip from consonant to consonant until, lighting upon a broad, open vowel, they rest upon that to restore the balance of sound. A common bullock driver on horseback delivering a message seemed to speak like an ambassador at a royal audience. In fact, they sometimes appeared to me to be a people on whom a curse had fallen, and stripped them of everything but their pride, their manners, and their voices.
And it was in this society that Michael began to mature as a man of responsibility. He was asked to construct 2 ships. The first ship was the Santa Barbara, which he, according to his account, was built out of a shipwreck that ran aground on the San Pedro. First ship, I would say first European ship, built in California. He also built a ship called the Guadalupe, and by accounts it was either owned by the mission or used for the service of the mission, and he was the skipper of that ship. Went down to Mexico a few times in the early 1830s. He also became, according to his account, he was the alcalde, which is a term that loosely used as magistrate for the Rancho Los Nietos. And Rancho Los Nietos was a massive piece of property. It was 300 square kilometers. It was several times larger than Rancho Santa Anita. It doesn't say what he did exactly, but you can tell that there's a relationship there with the powers in the area, Pio Pico and those folks. He became alcalde at a rancho called Rancho San Ysidro, which later was granted to him. So our poor little 13-year-old whaler out of Kent, England now is really a man on the take. And so he decides to take root and get married. And he marries a 17-year-old girl from the mission San Gabriel. His mother, Donna Eulalia, was said to be the oldest woman in California. And we'll talk about her in a minute. But importantly, it put him intimately in the circle of Pio Pico. And this was very rewarding to him throughout the next few decades of his life. She was, let's switch the slides. Yes, this is his mother-in-law, Donna Eulalia, oldest woman in California. Michael White believed that she was 96 at the time that he married her daughter, who was 17, which meant that she gave birth at age 79. By that chronology, she died at age 140, which would make her old. Some skeptics think that she was probably died at about age 108, which would make her a woman in her late 40s at the time that Maria was born. Very important woman. She held the keys to the mission. She was the caretaker for Mission San Gabriel. She was midwife to Pio Pico. So I don't know how intimate you can get with somebody, but being there when they're born and bring them into the world. She was a huge figure in early California history. And there's a bizarre passage in Michael White's account that said that she could take a thorn out of a man's eye with her tongue. I don't know why, I don't know how, but in the day, that was a big deal. And so, and I can sympathize, I married very well. Michael White married very well. We both married so well, in fact, that we got to live in San Marino. Shortly after he was married in 1839, so this is several years. I'm skipping through the years a little bit. I thought this was a really interesting story. William Workman had arrived in California, and if you grew up in the Covina Valley like me, you saw the name Workman all your whole life. Well, he was one of these early American settlers who took advantage of the opportunities in early California, but he was an American, had American connections. Needed to drive 50 head of cattle from his rancho to New Mexico, where Workman also had a store. Who did he pick? He chose wisely, he chose Michael White. Not because Michael White had been to New Mexico. There's no record of that in the history, and I think we'd know. But I think because he was a hands-on, hard-working man who was very resourceful. So Michael writes about this experience, and again, it's giving an oral history when he's advanced in age and looking back on the years. And you can read a few pages about this experience where he, and it's an experience of nearly 2 years. Doesn't talk a lot about cattle and doesn't talk a lot about the land. What he talks about are the Indians and how poorly they were treated by the Americans. And he touches on a few instances of cruelty. I'm not going to go into it here, but I can see that this is a man who's not entirely feels himself in the same league or in the same group as the new Americans that are coming in. Happy to work with them. You can tell they were friends. You could tell they relied on one another. But I think if you met him and met them, you would see that Michael White was maybe a little bit of a breed apart. Interesting, and to me, I don't know. This fact to me is so significant. I'm not sure I can explain why. But the return party was Don Benito Wilson and John Rowland as well. Don Benito. Grandfather to General Patton, kind of the patron, the sire of the area, was led to California by Michael White. So for that reason alone, I would call Michael White a seminal figure. Got him here safely, I would add. There's no record anywhere that Michael White mistreated Don Benito Wilson. In fact, to the contrary, I think they were close friends. Michael White also was granted a rancho in the Cajon Pass. He didn't hold it very long. He didn't live there very long. He held it probably about 10 or so, 20 years. And I think the idea was that you put Michael White there, then marauding natives, marauding Indians from the Mojave wouldn't come in and steal the cattle, and Michael White would shoot them, and there's a little bit of an account of some of that kind of gunplay. But I just thought this was this is the typical way to Southern California to LA from New Mexico, undoubtedly the way that the Wilson, Rowland, Workman, White party traveled in 1841. There are two episodes in his life, in his adult life, that I think are a lot of fun. And to me, I like California history. When I was a kid, we all grew up, that's my brother over there, we all got in my parents' VW van. They were teachers, and we drove across the United States. I was a third grader. It was a long drive. But we broke it up by going to battlefields. And they were great. Civil War, Revolutionary War battles. Really left an imprint, learned a lot about history that way. You never hear about the battles in California and the battles that led to our statehood. Well, there were two that they write about in California history in Southern California, and Michael White was in both, however, reluctantly. There were actually two battles of Cahuenga Pass. I don't know much about the first one. I know just a little more about the second one because Michael White was in it. But it was in 1845, and he didn't want to fight. And the battle was part of an insurrection against the governor, Miquel Torena, who was not very well liked. He was a Mexican governor, held power here for a couple years in the 1840s, and he was not well liked. He was a general, he was an important man, but he was not a Californian. His loyalties were to Mexico City, and it was a long way to Mexico City. We heard Anna talk about how long it was to get to the Capitol and back for the laws. And so, and he had this enforcement group, kind of like these stormtroopers, and they were shady characters, criminals, not nice people, maybe a bit of cruelty, and they called them cholos. And Pio Pico, who was born at the Mission, spent his entire life in California, had a popular local base of support. And I think the Americans kind of liked him too. And so what happened was Wilson and Workman and all their buddies wanted to support an insurrection against the Mexican governor because they knew ultimately it would lead to a relationship with the United States. There is a great quote that I think of, and the quote is, when Michael White was asked to support one of the many, what they called revolutions in California, he was asked by Mr. Don Sepulveda to fight against somebody. He said, I am not a citizen of revolutions, I'm a citizen of Mexico. He was asked by Roland and Wilson, are you with us in the party? And said, I'm with my own party. He was an individual. He didn't care about killing. He didn't care about politics. But he was taken up, and so where Universal Studios was a rancho. And you know the freeway, the 101 freeway going through a pass. Well, that's a naturally strategic area. The governor's troops were positioned there. The Americans with Michael White were positioned on the other side, and they started trading cannonballs. And you know what's great about our battles? It's hardly ever anyone ever gets killed. And in fact, in this battle, which was a turning point in the battle for independence of California, no one human was killed, just one horse lost his head due to a cannonball. What ultimately happened is the Americans did a move around through by where Disney Studios is now, the LA River, and they ultimately, I think, the governor and his troops, he couldn't hold discipline. He negotiated a peace and he left the country, and Pio Pico became governor, which is great news. That was the Battle of Coanga. About a year later, Michael White, again reluctantly, got involved in another skirmish in the Mexican-American War, which was really Americans in California fighting the Mexican squadrons. The story goes, according to Michael White's oral history, he was chopping wood and building a home for Hugo Reed at the location where Don Benito Wilson and the Pattons were going to ultimately settle. Ran out of lumber. Michael White had to go to San Gorgonio to get lumber, which is a fair bit. The halfway point was a place called Rancho Chino. And an American transplant, Isaac Williams, held a rancho there. So according to Michael White's account, he showed up one day in September, well-intentioned, spend the night before he passes on to San Gorgonio the next day, when all of a sudden 20 or so of these Americans led by Don Benito Wilson show up because they're being chased by the Mexicans. And there's a group of Mexicans coming from LA, there's a group of Mexicans coming from San Bernardino, and they're stuck, so they go to their friend Isaac Williams' rancho in Chino. So they're all spending the night together. And according to Michael White's account, he didn't want to be there then, but he just got swept up in it. And then, according to Michael White's account, he gave great advice to the Americans, is don't stay here in this ranch house, split up, make forts on either side, so when the Mexican forces come, you can surround them. But of course, they didn't listen to Michael White, and the Mexicans came and surrounded the rancho and lit the roof on fire, and Isaac Williams hoisted up the white flag, and they're all taken prisoner. If there is any controversy in Michael White's life, this might be where some of the controversy resides. You can tell that he has conflicting loyalties here. He's not strongly with the Americans. He just kind of wants to be on his own. When they're all taken prisoner, they're taken to LA, Boyle Heights area, and then they're taken down to Cerritos with the idea that they're going to be transported to Mexico. And that puts Michael White in great danger, because Michael White's a Mexican citizen. And he was a Mexican citizen accused of taking arms against Mexican soldiers. So he was in fear for his life. And there is talk that he escaped or he deserted the group. That's one point. The other, so he was recaptured, however. I don't know how, the details are a little fuzzy. But ultimately, Workman comes, and somehow Michael White and the others are released, and the idea is really that everyone knows everyone else in old California. The families are all intermarried. Michael White is he's really tight with Pio Pico, who's the governor, and although he's treasonous, he's still family, and blood is thicker than water. And so ultimately, he gets to go home back to Rancho San Ysidro.
Question?
Yes.
Who is the man in the picture?
Oh. Thank you, Mike. My brother. Don Benito Wilson. So, very much a key figure, friend of Michael White. Yes.
Can you diverge onto Workman, because there's still Workman Mill Road down there, and there's a couple other roads down there that's got people's names on them down there.
I know a little bit about Workman. I believe he had a ranch out in the San Gabriel Valley area, La Puente area. I'm not sure when he came to California. I believe it was probably in the 1830s. John is nodding his head if John knows more.
He came, pardon me, he came in 1841 from New Mexico. He was the part of
Right,
the
of course, I had it up
Roland
on-
Workman Party. That Michael White came back.
Well, Workman took Michael White out.
No, Workman was actually an Englishman.
Please.
All right, did he build a mill or not? Is the mill still open?
There is a mill in
It
La
says
Puente,
Workman
yes.
Mill Road. I wanna know where the mill is so I can grind some grain.
We'll move on. I will pass this over to John. And so the next San Marino Historical Society meeting, John Morse will have all the answers. Has anybody seen the movie Anchorman with Will Ferrell? You know, Ron Burgundy? Yes. I'm just the Ron Burgundy guy. And friends of the Michael White do. Yeah, we should call him Miguel Blanco. So here is where, around 1845, so ironically around the time that he's taking arms, he has been granted 78 acres just north of the mission, a mile and a half north of the mission, land that is now occupied by San Marino High School. Location, location, location. It was small, but it was plumb, and the reason it was plumb is that it had water. And of course, the Roland Fault runs along. You know, I mentioned La Presa, Raymond Fault. Thank you. I mentioned La Presa Dam and the old mill. Well, the same reason they had water, the same reason Michael White had water. The fault captured the flow of the water coming down from the hills. And so he and Maria settled down there in what is now San Marino High School. And that's the Michael White Adobe. That's why I got involved and ultimately came here today. But it's a 900 square foot, 3-room building. It has lasted a century and some 60, 70 years through earthquakes, fires, floods, the whole thing. It was really well built. And it's part of the land. You know, it's built of the land, the style of the land. It's fantastic, and that's really why I'm here. But I have to move on with the story. But I think this is now a really good time to introduce my last surprise guest. And that is Abby Shamray, who is a senior at San Marino High School. And Abby is magnificent. She's very special and dear to all our hearts because Abby won her Gold Award producing a film about the Michael White Adobe. And in that film is read a letter of a visitor to the Michael White Adobe in the 1850s. So I introduced to everybody Abby Shamray.
A letter written in 1852 by the wife of Judge Benjamin Hayes Southern California pioneer, to her sister in the East, is published in Pioneer Notes from the Diaries of Judge Benjamin Hayes, edited by Marjorie Tisdale Walcott and printed in 1929 in Los Angeles. The following excerpt from this letter gives an interesting description of the Michael White adobe and its environs, as they appeared at that time. Mrs. Hayes to a sister. Los Angeles, March 13th, 1852. My dear sister, we have made a visit in the country, went out Wednesday and returned Saturday. The country is beautiful, but I suppose there is no comparison between it now and 20 years ago. The gentleman we visited has been here 22 years. He lives only a mile and a half from the mission of San Gabriel. This mission is almost in ruins. The large church is yet in good repair, but most of the other buildings have fallen down. 20 years ago, says Mr. White, it was in a flourishing condition, the country all around in cultivation, with several mills and fine orchards of all kinds of fruit. There were about 1,000 Indians kept employed, and all happy, the padres being like fathers to them. Beside the farm, mills, orchards, and vineyards, all kinds of manufacturers were carried on immediately at the mission. We rode over to it, and it made me sad to see it after hearing what it had been only a few years since. We visited the orange orchard, a remnant of what it was, yet a pleasant sight. Large trees hanging full of fruit, others just blooming and the air filled with the fragrance of the bloom. There are now only about 50 trees. A few years ago, there were 500. There is still standing a large pear orchard and one of olives. Mr. White has a Californian wife. She appears to be a fine woman, but they know nothing of the comforts of life. Their house was cold and dirty. The chickens and dogs stay in it as much as the children. An American lady, a near neighbor, came and invited us home with her. We went and stayed till after tea, quite a treat. They were living in a log, or rather a pole house, with a good large fireplace and a cheerful fire. I felt quite at home, imagined myself in a log cabin in Missouri or Illinois. We returned to Mr. White's by moonlight, half a mile, a beautiful walk. Mr. White has much the best house, but at Mr. Taylor's everything was clean and comfortable. Whilst out there, we received several presents. One gave us 2 or 3 dozen oranges, and Mr. White, a nice little pig, scarce in this country, and 2 chickens, just right for boiling. Unfortunately, they got away from us. He also gave us a keg of vinegar, and on the last Saturday, a fine mess of green peas, the first I have yet seen. We locked up the house when we left, and an Indian remained in care of the garden.
They're nice people, not the best housekeepers, but they're hospitable people. Very quickly, I know it's time to wrap up, so we're going to quickly get into the Michael White Adobe portion, and there's some good slides. This, I'm just going to say, buy the book, buy the Centennial book. This plot is in there, and you can see the Rancho San Pascual, and that little purple spot in the middle is the Michael White Rancho San Ysidro plot about where the high school is. He lived there until 1875. His, according to the record, his daughter and son-in-law then came into the adobe. Not a whole lot is known about this period of his life. It didn't sound like it was good. Like many old Californians, they did not do well when California became a state. And he died in 1885, which is quite an accomplishment for the age, I'd say. After he died, the Michael White Adobe then changed hands 5 or 6 times till the San Marino School District came into it. And I wasn't going to put in Van Nuys there on this. You know, San Fernando Valley is, you know, so gauche. But history is history. Van Nuys owned it for about 30 years, so we have to put it up. We're duty bound. You'll notice the wooden structure. That is not adobe, that's wood. The adobe is the 1 story. The wooden structure was erected by Michael's daughter and son-in-law in the 1870s, they believe. They found some newspapers on the wall with with the date around 1877. That was there for a good long time, 70, 80 years before it was removed to El Monte, right, or San Gabriel? San Gabriel. I always thought that's where all the 13 children lived, but apparently not. We have some great pictures, of course, courtesy of the Historical Society. Kind of a poignant chapter in the history of the adobe, where we first start seeing photographs of the building in the 30s and early 40s. It was a nursery of a Japanese family, and they leased it, and then they were relocated for the internment. And there were two possible spellings. I went with the A, so it's Tomayasu family, and that's Mr. Tomayasu there. If you were there at the school, you'd be standing in right field, looking to the northwest. And all those trees and the fruit trees would be in the swimming pool. And I had thought Michael White built the swimming pool for his kids, but I was wrong about that. More views of the Michael White adobe again in the 1930s. You can see the vineyards. Just an interesting little California bungalow. More still. And all these pictures, I would, courtesy of the San Marino Historical Society, so thank you. The relationship with the school district is pretty interesting. Just a few words on that. They leased it to a groundskeeper, Mr. Garcia, who lived there for several years. And he was the one who moved the wooden structure to San Gabriel. Then we get into the interplay between actually a school and the building, where K.L. Carver comes in and is such a hero to us. So K.L., as we all know, the high school originally was the elementary school, and then there were plans ultimately to turn it into a high school. This was in the early 50s, and K.L. Carver, as most of us know, I'm sure by heart, some of us are visitors to San Marino, was the president of the school board for many, many years. I think it was about 13 years and 19 years on the board. Very dedicated to the children of San Marino, very dedicated to establishing the showpiece school district of California. So dedicated to the children of San Marino, he named himself after the elementary school. No disrespect meant. But he saw vision, and there's a great quote up here, of course. There's another one I didn't put on the slide, and I just have to read it. It's not profound, but it's very important. K.L. Carver said, "All too many of our landmarks are being raised in the path of progress," which is very true. It's true today. And he was the one who saw the Michael White adobe as a resource, not as a nuisance, not as something that's in the way, and not something that's blocking an expansion of some type of school facility. It itself was necessary for the mission of education. And that is the inspiration for the Friends of the Michael White adobe. K.L. Carver got the community together. We have the picture here. Hopefully everybody can see it here. It was not in great shape. It was falling down. It was much worse shape than it is today. And they did their best. They raised the funds. They rehabilitated and restored it the best they knew. I have gotten to know some many fine historians and restoration architects and design professionals, and someone may criticize some of the work that was done, but I'll tell you, thank goodness he had that vision and he did that. And the handful of us that are on the board of the Michael White adobe are so glad he did, and wish that we can be as successful as he was in preserving the Michael White adobe for the children. I didn't go to San Marino High School. I know many who did, and it was the PEP adobe. I've spoken to many who hadn't been inside the adobe for 30 years, 25 years, but they all say it was the PEP adobe. And they let them sit on the roof. So I don't think anyone's talking Pep Adobe now, but it's not a bad idea. Here it is today. It's a beautiful little building. It's a little building. It's not Mount Vernon. What's sad about it, however, is the fence. And the fence went up when, you know, there's a lot of concern, and we understand the concern about its structural integrity. It's not reinforced. So the idea is a big earthquake could cause damage and someone could get hurt. And that's just too bad. It's sad that the Michael White Adobe has to be fenced off. You can go, anyone on the board of the Friends of Michael White Adobe would be pleased to give you a tour, and we've had it open for homecoming. There's no problem being inside it. It just can't be a school building. And so because of that, the decision was made to fence it off and lock the doors and put up warning signs, and that's I can think of no other word, but it's just a little sad. So here's what oh, there it is. Before I get into the sexy slides about its future, this is the high school, that's the baseball field, there's the football field, there's the pool, and there's the Michael White Adobe. So it really is, it is on campus. It's always been on campus, and it's always going to be on campus. So the idea is to give it a use that is consistent with its location, where it's always been in the middle of a high school. You've seen the pictures now for an hour. This is some renderings of a concept, and the idea is to open it up. It wouldn't be open during school hours, but it would be open along the outside, and it could be used after school. And it could be brought into the lives of the students, and they would know this is the Michael White Adobe, and there would be interest in who the man was and all the places he went and the things he did and the people he knew. And it would bring history alive to our students. And it's not that hard to do. We are developing, not only are we doing renderings, we're coming up with estimates. It's just one idea for the inside, is to make it a student hall of fame. So, you know, a building needs a purpose. People need a reason to go there. People might go to a history museum once or twice, but if it's a hall of fame and it has, you can see your friends' pictures there, you can go back if you're an alumni and look back on your accomplishments. I have someone in my family who's with the San Marino Athletics Hall of Fame. I'd be delighted to see her picture there. It doesn't have to be athletics. It's arts and academics. There's the 3 A's. There's in San Marino, that's our logo in the San Marino School District, of the 3 A's. Entirely consistent with a building the size of the Michael White Adobe with 3 rooms. There's the 4th A, and that's alumni. So I'm going to make my pitch. This is the last slide. I'm going to make my pitch, and the pitch is this. We have goals. We have plans. We need the community support with money. We've received grants. We just got a grant from the Pankow Foundation. We have a historic preservation grant that we're working with, but it's just the start. You know, if you were reading the papers or listening to the scuttlebutt of a couple years ago, there was talk about moving the Adobe, and it was going to be a 7-figure operation, and they're going to put it in the park. It's not a bad idea, but it's moving the Adobe, and it's way, way, way more expensive than it needs to be. You can have a perfectly usable, beautiful little historic building in the middle of your high school for a fraction of that. I'm not going to give you a number. It's a lot less than $1 million. It's more than 100,000, but and it's perfectly doable. We have a website. If you're so inclined, it is the end of the year. If you're doing your tax planning, we are a 501c3. We have a donate button at our website. If you are not an internet person and you are a checkbook person, we have John Morris. Your your friend and ours, and he's always around. We'd love to talk to you. No amount too small, please. And thank you very much for your time. And thank you
Bill has really put his heart and his soul into being on the board of the Friends of Michael White Adobe, and I've enjoyed the pleasure of getting to know him. And I'm sure you folks must have one or two questions for him about Miguel Blanco. Anybody?
When you were talking about the whaling episode of his life, and you were talking he was gone for many years, do you know anything about how the process of getting the whale oil back to England? I mean, I'm assuming then the ships didn't go out and hunt and then go back if he never returned. So did they just barrel it up and then send it on another ship, or how was it transported?
Well, I think the most typical way is they would kill the whale, they would haul it up on board, they'd slaughter it, they'd chop it up, they'd boil it down, they'd boil down the blubber, turn it into oil, put it into barrels on board the ship. And when they filled up the ship with all these barrels of oil, they'd go home.
That would?
Yeah.
Oh.
The wooden structure that was next door to the adobe, is that still in San Gabriel? Is it standing today, and where is it located?
Yes, and
It's on Los Tunas, right, Gene?
No,
No,
I
it's
don't know.
not on Los Tunas.
What is it?
It's
It
in
is
California
very
Street.
close to the San Gabriel Nursery
Yeah.
on San
Right.
Gabriel Boulevard. I think the street is just to the east,
Yeah.
west, pardon me. I believe the street's called El Molino.
That's right.
El
Monte. No, that's right.
It's El Molino.
No, it's El Monte. It's,
Okay, El Monte.
704
But-
El Monte.
All right, but I have been in it. I have been on been inside that building. It was back in sometime in the 1980s when it was on the market. And the president of the Historical Society and quite a few of the members of the board were realtors. And so about 4 of us went down and pretended, I guess we were buyers, I don't know. And anyway, went through it. And it was interesting because from the front, it does not look one bit like the addition. But if you walk around, at that time, if you walked around to the side and the back, it was still the same building. It was very recognized. But it was a beautiful building inside, house. It had the typical high ceilings, heavy molding, and it had been turned into a couple of apartments.
Yeah, there are 2 families that live in that.
Yeah. But anyway, I was lucky enough to go in.
thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Oh, and I'd like to clear up a little misconception about the fence around the adobe. I was a member of the board when it was put up, and it wasn't put up to protect the public from the building falling down. We had, after every football game, there would be vandalism to the building. So it was put up to protect the building.
Marilyn?
The interview that you're talking about, is that the Bancroft Library interview?
Yes,
The oral history?
yes.
Any newspapers of the time that you came across that mentioned his name? Or the local newspapers in LA?
I have to say no, and I have to say that I did not go that deep into my research. I was looking really hard through the Dana book to see if I could, identify contact, and I thought I might have, but no newspapers.
Thank you.
Are there any known photographs of him? And with all his 13 children, are there any living descendants that you know?
Tons of living descendants.
Yes, yeah, there are. There are quite a few, as a matter of fact, about, I'm sorry, Phil. We had 7 generations of Michael White Adobe coming back to, 7 representatives from about 4 different generations, coming back to the Michael White Adobe. They'd never been inside it, and Pearl White was his 7th granddaughter, 7th generation granddaughter. She passed away about 3 or 4 years ago now, and it was really like the trip of a lifetime for her. She came in, we had a chance to see her there. Jean Dryden was there with me, and it was really it was a great experience.
Any photos?
Yes.
There are existing
Yeah,
photographs?
Pearl White, Pearl White, no.
No, no,
Oh,
Michael.
Michael White, no.
No, Michael.
Well,
just had a comment and then a question. I don't find it really surprising you died penniless after 13 children. My question is, the source of the water, was it artesian or groundwater? Was it groundwater then, or where was the water for
Well,
the?
thank goodness we have John Morris here.
Well, at that time, if you recall looking at the map, and if you need a copy of the map, the book's available tonight if you need to buy it. But there was swampland up north of where the adobe was. That was the upside of the Raymond Fault. So that was artesian at that time. It wasn't artesian after well pumps were started in the 1890s, 1900s. They started drawing down the water table, so it was no longer artesian. There also were water courses flowing through, including Rubio Wash, immediately to the west of his adobe. So we had water available. Marilyn?
And just an aside, that's where the little girl, Kathy Fiskus, fell down the wells in that area, down,
Yeah.
and her father was in charge of the waterworks.
He was superintendent of
Yes.
of California Water
Yes, and he was
before it
just-
became California
He was
American.
trying to get them covered, and he didn't do it in time.
Well, he was trying to get the state to
Yep.
pass a law on abandonment of wells,
Right.
and cost him his daughter, but eventually he got there. Okay, Bill, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. As I indicated, the books are available. If anybody, Judy and Wayne Carter have a number of copies here. Other thing I want to let you know is what our plans are. We're not having a program in December. We typically meet here in this room on the fourth Monday of the month, unless that's a holiday, in which that case we move it to the third Monday. So as of now, January 28th will be Rolf Hellstrup on Memories of Pearl Harbor from December 7th, 1941. He was a teenager living very close. His father worked for the Navy at that time, naval architect, and he's going to tell us about his memories of Pearl Harbor. Then on February 25th, we have Peter Arnett from Pacific Electric. He's going to talk on its impacts on Southern California development. We would hope that had been earlier, but it didn't happen that way. Then what we have tentatively, not necessarily confirmed, March 25th, Nick Curry is going to talk to us about the Guggenheim family role in the beginnings of JPL. And April 22nd is tentatively Tim Lindsay to talk about the Robinson's Gardens and their tie, and I don't know if you've been talked to, Tim. I'm getting ahead of my program chair here. May 20th, we're looking at Dave Jurasovich to talk about the Mount Wilson Observatories. And then on June 24th, working with the City Centennial Committee on the City of Hope and their centennial.
And we have centennial maps on the, calendars up through January on the library desk.
So that's what our tentative program is, and we're glad to see new faces here and many people, and glad you came out, and hope you continue to enjoy us. Gene?
These are all gonna be videotapes and put on channel 28
Channel 19.
and 19 with it.
Yes. Our videographer's been doing a great job for us this year. Jim?
What's your publicity for these dates? Is it just in the grapevine, or is the
No.
the Trib gonna cover it or something?
We put it in the grapevine. We work with the library. The library puts out notices and publicity for every single program in advance. And we also send material to the Tribune. We don't control what the Tribune prints.
It's also in the newsletter, on the Centennial website, and in the rec guides. So
Great.
we're doing
Thanks,
everything
Liz.
we can.
Thanks all.